Tom, could you just set out for me, please, why you actually think the windfall tax is sound policy? I'm assuming you do.
Yeah, it corrects an original sin, Darren, which is the billions of pounds in profits that oil and gas companies are making from a sort of freak situation on the global markets, not through innovation. So we feel the windfall tax is a good idea to help struggling families who are really struggling as a result of the prices of energy.
Right, OK. So, Andy, why are you vehemently opposed to it then? Do you actually think that this is going to, I mentioned at the start there, the post-Brexit opportunities that this country has taken. If the windfall tax is a signal to consumers, what's the signal to the global business markets?
Well, he's not entirely wrong. I mean, you can make a case for a windfall tax on certain situations. For example, when the government's made a big policy mistake that gives an industry a windfall, then it sometimes uses a windfall tax to correct that. In the North Sea, the case is usually made that because this is a precious national resource, there should be higher taxes. And that's why there was already a windfall tax on the North Sea at 40%. Everybody else pays 19%. So this additional windfall tax, going up to levels that we've not seen since the early 1980s, is an absolute disaster. And we know the investment impact because BP have said that they're reviewing their portfolio. Shell have come out and attacked and said it's incoherent. The Industry Association is now saying they're fighting to stop companies leaving, going to other places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Norway even. So what a shambles. What a stupid thing for the government to do, having spent months and months saying they weren't going to do it.
So, Tom, good for the coffers of Newcastle United under the new Saudi regime, but less good for those with pensions in Britain, eh?
Well, these taxes have been introduced in the past, not least by Mrs. Thatcher, and there was no loss of investment in that time, so there's no reason to think that this would happen now. And BP said they wouldn't change their investment plans initially, so I don't see why that would be the case in this situation.
Andy?
Sorry, that's just not true. We know from the past history of windfall tax on the North Sea that it has an utterly disastrous impact on both investment and tax revenues. Geoffrey Howe introduced one, he's right. The long-term consequence of that was that by 1992, tax revenues had collapsed by 90%. Gordon Brown introduced one, then raised it again. George Osborne raised it. Investment went down each time. The situation in 2015 and 16 was so bad that the government was paying out negative taxation to oil and gas companies because they'd made such a hash of the tax system. So what Rishi Sunak's just done is combined George Osborne's rise with George Osborne's panicked reaction of creating an investment allowance on top of it, all at the same time. And we can see the company's reaction. They are going to be retreating with their investment plans at high speed.
Yeah, well, Andy, I liked what you said about Rishi Sunak being the most successful socialist chancellor this century. But Tom has got a good point, hasn't he, on the way in which consumers are really struggling. And a lot of consumers, Andy, will be looking at the vast profits made by these big oil giants and thinking, well, hang on a minute, I can't afford to put my heating on.
Well, that's a great point. And there isn't an absolute prohibition on windfall taxes from free marketeers. You can make a case, as I said earlier, if there's a policy error of correcting it. Well, the place where there's a huge policy error is in renewable generation. Gordon Brown's administration introduced the renewables obligation. What that did was mean that these renewable companies would be rewarded when gas prices were high. And that's happening now. They used to have profit margins of about 30 to 50%. They're now up to over 100%. And that's all going on our bills. That's one of the things that's contributing to the cost of living crisis. So if you're going to do this consistently, you'd be taking the windfall tax across the board. You'd be removing the renewable subsidies entirely for the duration of this crisis. That would genuinely help people. That would have an immediate impact on bringing down bills.
Tom, should we scrap the green taxes from energy bills? Wouldn't that help hard-pressed consumers?
Well, that isn't what's being proposed. And, we need to act to help these millions of families who have bills spread out on the kitchen table. And I think the Chancellor has taken a positive step forward with what he's proposing here. So we're in support of this windfall tax on oil and gas particularly. OK. Now, folks, I'd want you both to set out your story. You've heard what the arguments from each other is. Why, actually, do you think this, Andy, if you say why the government is actually losing its focus on this, losing its track and needs to get back focused on actually delivering on the Brexit opportunities and all of these other things?
Where I and Tom are going to agree is that you do need to help people. The best way of doing that is borrowing money in order to pay for targeted welfare. You don't need to create special new taxes. The Chancellor should reverse the tax rises he proposed earlier this year. He should look at cutting other taxes. We can cope with the borrowing for some time before we then pay it back on the growth that would then follow if we didn't start imposing silly taxes on business.
OK. Tom, quite reasonable, I thought.
No, look, these are freak profits generated out of nowhere, and it's right that they should be redirected to the millions of families who are really, really struggling. So we think this is the right move. And in fact, there's scope for it to go higher. These companies are generating 20 billion alone in profits this year. Perhaps Sunak should have done more.
Well, there we are, folks. That's two disagreements, but we'll agree to disagree. That was the head of advocacy at Tax Justice UK, Tom Peters, and energy analyst Andy Mayer. Thank you very much for your company today.